Anyway, thank you for having me here, and I'm mostly doing research on Japanese literature, but I'm trying today to talk about medieval ways of living in Japan, and I hope this kind of resonates with the theme of these different subjects that have been discussed here. And also I would like to apologize because I arrived yesterday from Hawaii. My brain is a little bit is still asleep, so I might rely on my papers more than I wanted to. So I'm sorry about reading maybe at some points from this paper I've written. So today I want to talk about this one particular person. He's called Kamo no Chōmei, and he lived at the end of 12th century, in the beginning of 13th century in Japan. And this particular era was known for very many different changes that took place in the society. There was a huge civil war, the system of government changed. Also, there were very many disasters that happened during 12th century. There was a famine, there was a lot of earthquakes. Horrible things happened to people, and Kamo no Chōmei is known as one of the foremost chronicles of this particular era. He writes about the history of this era, some of the events that took place, and also about the solutions he came up with during this turbulent time. How to live in such an age is his most important question. And in his very short autobiographical text called Record of the 10-Foot Square Hut, he writes about many of these everyday practices that are so important to Buddhist recluses like him. And these practices, like composing poetry, playing music on biwa and koto, medieval instruments, repeating the name of Amida Buddha in quiet contemplation, taking long strolls to famous places known from poetry, gathering autumn leaves, looking at the full moon, are all part of the same set of practices that most of the medieval recluses who renounced life and went to live in the mountains usually engage in. But there is one thing that makes him very different, and this is his practice of architecture. Here he differs from all the others. His ultimate quest was to construct a movable dwelling which would suit anyone who has to live in an impermanent world where everything is in constant flux. And when we think about medieval time, in Japan, many of the practices like writing poetry, for example, and even playing music could be a path to awakening or enlightenment. So writing poetry brought you closer to truth. If you did it well, you might even achieve satori, enlightenment or awakening. Then architecture was not so high up in the rankings of the arts. Nobody was talking about architecture as being something that might lead to awakening. But Kamo no Chōmei clearly thought about architecture as a serious art form, and thought about different ways that architecture could be elevated to some other level. But going forward, this particular text is known to most of the Japanese. It's part of the general school education, and it starts with the words. I cite Pärt and Watson's translation throughout. You can find it in this wonderful book called Four Huts, Asian Writings on Simple Life, if you're interested. And it goes like this. The river flows on unceasingly, but the water is never the same water as before. Bubbles that bob on the surface of the still places disappear one moment and reappear again the next, but they seldom endure for long. And so it is with people of this world and with the houses they build. So from here, this particular passage is usually described as the essence of Japanese sense of impermanence, which is called mujokan in Japanese, which means that everything in this world is in constant flow. Everything shall eventually pass or wither away. There is nothing that is really permanent. We can't rely on anything really in this world. And this gives a sense of very pessimistic worldview, doesn't it? And this is how usually Kamo no Chōmei is interpreted, as somebody who subscribed to this idea that we can't really, well, that life is short and there's really no point to make an effort in this world. But although this might be partly true, this kind of interpretation of his writings tends to overshadow this practical solution to the problems, which is rarely discussed. And this is precisely the idea of movable dwelling. If the world is impermanent, if it is in constant flow, the building itself must become a kind of a boat that can float on these rivers of impermanence, move along with the winds and waves. And this is the kind of building I think he sets out to build in the end. Chōmei's approach to environment or the world is based on the standard reading of Buddhist philosophy. So everything in this world is at the mercy of four great elements: fire, water, wind, earth. And to explain this, he analyzes the buildings in the capital, Heian, where everything seems to be eternal when you look at it. All the houses seem very nice and strong, but when you look at it closely, Chōmei argues, one can see that some buildings have burnt down, some have crumbled during storms, have been rebuilt into smaller buildings. And when we look at the history of any city, we can see that it is actually impermanent. The buildings are in constant change, they are constantly being rebuilt, they are constantly in the process of becoming or change. But the idea that the buildings are impermanent, however, it's not only the reason of the flaw of the impermanent environment, but the buildings themselves are not able to adapt to this impermanent environment. So one needs to build something that can adapt, that can change with the world. And it is very interesting that Chōmei doesn't, he subscribed to this Buddhist idea of non-duality. When he describes the river, he also thinks about the bodies of the human beings. So the buildings are changing, are flowing, and human bodies also. Human bodies are also nothing but the foam on the river. And here he actually cites Vimalakirti Sutta, where one of the main Mahayana sutras, where it is said, this body is like a cluster of foam, nothing you can grasp or handle. This body is like a bubble that cannot continue for long. Reading Chōmei's description of the capital, Heian, we can see that he treats human bodies and buildings much in the same way. And his descriptions of destruction of the capital, the parts of buildings become body parts of the dead people, for example. There is no real distinction between the broken pillar of a temple and the broken limbs of the dead. They are almost described in the same way. Vimalakirti was the man who secluded himself in 1 foot square room, from which the title of this particular text comes. It's Hojo in Japanese. And held conversations about the nature of existence with Bodhisattva Manjushri. And in this teaching, it is said that we should not think of the body and mind as separate things, and we should surely not think of body as a container for the mind. In the same way, we shouldn't think of the place as a container for buildings, but mind and body, building and place are intimately intertwined in the process of dwelling at some certain place. So we shouldn't think about these non-dually, but dwelling is actually a process that brings together mind and body, building and place. And Chōmei certainly seems to think that since the relationship of bodies and buildings is very intimate, we could also solve problems people face by creating better buildings. So one should, of course, meditate and search for inner peace. But since body and mind are connected, one could also start by building perfect dwellings. So let us now take a closer look of these stages he goes through while searching for this perfect dwelling. And he describes at least 2 stages in the process of search. This first stage is moving towards smaller and smaller buildings that still have some sort of territory and garden, and then to find that you can see that he's on the quest to find this perfect setting where one could have an actual permanent dwelling. And in the second stage, he kind of renounces this idea altogether and moves toward a movable dwelling. So in this first stage, he describes it like this. When I was something over 30, I decided to build a little domicile of my own. It was only 1/10 of the size of my former dwelling, big enough to live in, though in no way elaborate. It had mud wall of sorts to enclose it, but I could not afford a proper gate. Using bamboo for posts, I rigged a shed to house a carriage. Whenever it snowed or wind blew hard, I couldn't help feeling apprehensive. As it stood near the riverbed of the Kamo, there was always the danger of flooding, and I worried a lot about robbers. So what happens when you choose a perfect place for your small dwelling is that you're not quite sure how it's going to work out. In the end, you find that you don't like your neighbors, or they are too loud, or that the river that seemed so peaceful during summer has some flooding or some other dangers during another season. So these flooding and robbers and this kind of environmental problems become apparent while one lives in a certain place. And when you have already set yourself up and made an effort to build this nice house on the Kamo river and find you want to move it, that's where you start to think about whether you should build a house in a way that you can easily dismantle it and move it to another place. And also, if we look at the text, we can see that he talks about former buildings and some latter buildings, so we can see that maybe he went through many different versions of this idea before coming up with something particular. Not everything is described in the text, so we can imagine that he tested out different possibilities. Well, in the end, during his 50s, he moved into the hills of Ohara, which was at the time very popular among the Buddhist recluses, which is kind of strange when we read that during the in that Ohara area, it was swarming with recluses. So people wanted to be alone, to live as a hermit in the mountains, but they all chose the same place. So eventually they were on the different slopes of the same hill, and the next neighbor was maybe only 200 meters away behind the bushes. So it was quite crowded and not quite like the silent, simple life we usually tend to imagine when we think about Japanese recluses. But there he must have familiarized himself with different types of temporary buildings and movable dwellings that the recluses might have had. These are not preserved, so we can only imagine what these wooden small houses might have looked like at the time. And actually, this particular text we are looking at today is one of the most reliable sources, which actually has descriptions of buildings in it, and not only descriptions of the beautiful moon and things like these. And based on this particular text by Kamo no Chōmei, we can reconstruct basically what the building could have looked like, and we're going to look at it in a moment. So at the age of 60, he finally moves to the Hino Mountains, another area which was popular among the recluses at the time. And there he built his kind of ultimate masterpiece known from this text, Hojoki. And he writes, "My present place is unlike any ordinary dwelling. It measures only 10 feet square and less than 7 feet in height. Since I never thought of it as permanent residence, I did not divine to see whether the site was auspicious or not. So he did not rely on usual feng shui rules and things like this. It has dirt foundation, a simple roof of thatch, and the joints are held together with metal fastenings. This is so that if I decide I do not like the spot, I can easily move it. It should be no trouble at all to take it apart and put it together again. 2 carts would hold it all, with no other expense than the labor to pull the carts. What you see on this image is the reconstruction of this particular hut based on the same passage you're reading now. So the only knowledge we have it is left behind by the author. And on the picture, this particular reconstruction of the hut is in the Shimogamo shrine area in Kyoto. So if you ever go to Kyoto, you can actually visit this place and see it for yourself. And if you read Burton Watson's translation, it says here that that it has a dirt foundation, which makes it a kind of a fixed building, which you cannot actually move. When we read Japanese research on this particular wording of the text, it says that tsuchi, which might mean dirt foundation, usually means also a framework supporting the roof. So it would be more appropriate in this case to translate it as a kind of a support framework or something like this. It means that it didn't have a fixed foundation, rather a wooden framework which is held together by these metal fastenings called kakegane in Japanese, which was probably designed by himself because nobody else seems to mention the same kind of fastening type in descriptions of other wooden buildings at the time. So the design seems to be his own, and it is built to be taken apart with these maybe hooks, kakegane, some sort of metal fastenings, and then all the logs or the parts of this building can be loaded on the 2 carts and pulled with oxes easily to another place. So it's not quite the hut anymore. It's a pretty well-built building. You need 2 carts. Another variation of this text says that you can use only 1 cart to move it. So people, I think on the later age, when they edited this text to a simpler version, thought that it would be so much cooler if you could load it on 1 cart instead of 2, and kind of re-edited it. But it's interesting to note that the word used for building in Japanese is musubu, which actually means bind together. And it's used usually in descriptions of different kind of temporary buildings and huts. Iori or musubu, to bind together a hut, which comes from the idea that you can use branches and leaves and different handy materials just to bind or bundle together a building for yourself. But the verb binding seems to me to be very appropriate to describe this kind of process of dwelling also, dwelling in the mountains. Because musubu also means to take shape, to form. It also appears in the first passage of Hojoki we read earlier, where the bubbles were forming on the surface of the water. The same verb is used there. The bubbles form, take shape, and then are scattered again. So the buildings also, they form for a temporary period of time, then they are also scattered again. And this musubu, binding together a hut, means to be engaged in a placemaking. It's also binding together the various possibilities of life in that particular area, the different pathways one can take from your hut to the mountains, for example, to see different famous sites. It's also about connections with other locations and how you can move your hut from one famous spot to another, for example, if you need to. So binding together yourself into the hut, and the hut is also bound together with the location in a very intimate way, is the process of dwelling as such, for Kamo no Chōmei, I would say. And when anthropologist Tim Ingold has said that we do not live in places, but rather to and from places, this kind of description seems very appropriate in his case, where we can see how these different paths are very important for him. And I'm going to come back to this a little bit later. And musubu means also living together with one's building. The house should naturally take form according to the changes in both the inhabitant and the environment. Both of these changes, the inhabitant, the one who lives or dwells, is constantly changing, and the environment is changing too. So the ideal building could be kind of in the inner intersection of these two, and these two bind together in a dwellable space in an interesting way. Oh, sorry. I don't know if I have enough time. Okay, switch. So he says, I have put together a lodging for my final days. I'm like a traveler who prepares shelter for one night, or an aging silkworm spinning its cocoon. The size is not even 1/100th that of the house where I lived in middle age. You might say that as my years have grown in number, my houses have gotten smaller and smaller. And then the hermit crab prefers a little shell because he knows the dimensions of his own body. I am the same. Knowing my own size and knowing the ways of the world, I crave nothing, chase after nothing. I desire only peaceful spot and delight in being free from care. So here we can see that the building should almost be like an outer layer of body, like a set of comfortable clothes, wearing which you do not feel like you're wearing anything really, because they breathe and they are naturally layering on your body. It's something like Hundertwasser has called the third skin that the building should be, like a cocoon or a shell. Shell is maybe not even a good metaphor, because it should contract and expand. The hermit crab can change shells. When he becomes bigger, he moves into another vessel. So that's a good idea of switching your home according to the size. And using terminology coined by Deleuze and Guattari, we could say that this shows an attempt to territorialize one's body. So where in the first stage one would have still some sort of garden, or staying in one place one would have a territory. In this case, the body itself becomes a territory, like a cocoon, where one inhabits in a perfect way. So instead of finding a place in this world, one becomes the place, and body becomes the territory one inhabits. So from these descriptions of different stages Chōmei went through, we can see that there are two ways of building temporary dwellings. One is building a new building each time one moves, a very light building maybe, and one is then use carts to move the whole building. And it was usually the case with the recluses' huts that they left the buildings behind. Whatever they bound together from the leaves or grasses were left behind, or even the smaller houses were left behind. And then we have a lot of nice poems about these sad, dilapidated buildings with moss growing on the roofs, and the poet might wonder who lived here. Oh, life is so impermanent. It used to be a nice building, but now it's all gone and the life has gone. But it seems when the nomadic culture is dominant actually, then these kind of places are not seen to be very sad. For example, in the United States, John Brinkerhoff Jackson has studied vernacular architecture in American culture, and says that there is nothing sad in a deserted house in the American landscape. Instead, when you see this kind of house, the deserted house 9 times out of 10 is a chrysalis from which its inhabitants have happily escaped to some brighter, more alluring future. So when you think about these people who move to new working places, find new opportunities in another city and leave the old house behind, then in this kind of culture it seems, I'm not quite sure, it seems to be customary more to imagine that, oh great, they have found a better life somewhere else. Whereas when I see a house like this, it fills me with sadness, and I wonder how bad it all went, and they lost everything, maybe. So there are 2 ways to approach this kind of deserted building. One is to be filled with sadness. That's how I usually feel. But it seems that one could also approach them with this kind of more positive attitude and see that, oh good, they left this dump behind and moved somewhere else where you have a nice building somewhere else. But again, these images of a shell or a chrysalis or anything other is customary in these cases. You see that Jackson also uses this kind of imagery when talking about deserting a house. And the movable dwelling itself, a mobile home, and all these trailer cars that are trailer houses that are so popular in the United States, actually also have roots in China, as many things have their roots in China. For example, and these are the examples that Kamo no Chōmei might have known, Tang Dynasty poet Meng Jiao moved his furniture. Whenever he moved his furniture, it only took up 1 ox cart. He didn't want to have any excess things, and he was famous for it. And another famous scholar living in seclusion was Fan Zan, who apparently stayed in his cart for 36 years without getting off once. So he was kind of a forefather of all mobile home dwellers, I would say. The poets and scholars usually renounced ownership, stepped outside of the bounds of society, and embraced living like a cloud floating on the wind. It was something that people thought of as necessary when one wanted to be critical of the society, for example. One needed to live in such a way. But also in Japan, there is the idea that spirit beings, or gods, called kami in Japanese, are of 2 kinds. One of them are stable, who like to stay in one place, and the others are more nomadic, who like to come down from the mountains only once in a while and dwell among humans. And also the shrine architecture, therefore, is quite different in these cases, whether it was built for a kami who wanted to stay in that particular place, and completely different kind of architecture for those kami who might move around. And these 2 traditions were quite separate, and interestingly enough, Kamo no Chōmei came from the lower Kamo shrine, which is known for this mobile kami, who did not actually live in the Shimo-Kamo area, but came down from the mountains only occasionally. And their shrine tradition was based around this idea of kami itself, or kind of spirit beings and gods being mobile and not staying in one place too long. And therefore, he was very familiar with different ideas behind building a temporary dwelling for kind of temporary beings, so to speak. So let us now move forward and think about what it actually means to live in a movable dwelling for a poet recluse such as Kamo no Chōmei. I pointed out before that one of the reasons you need to be able to move your building is the changes in the environment. That you have robbers and floodings and things, or maybe it becomes too hot during the summer, so you want to move it into the shade. These kind of practical reasons are of course there, but I think for Kamo no Chōmei and the people like him, it was even more important to to cultivate aesthetic intensity. Moving is not only about avoiding the danger, it is about achieving a certain kind of intensity one needs for writing poetry and playing music and creating art. And Chōmei is very open to the idea of splendid views which fuel poetry and music. And the Chinese poet Bai Jui, whom Chōmei cites in Hojoki, has said in his famous 4-line poem dedicated to the local landlord, an owner, Mu. And the poem goes like this: "Ever the most splendid sights lack a permanent owner." Chōmei seems to subscribe to this idea that the wandering poet or monk has an advantage of not being an owner. And what it means to be an owner is essentially to value this one place and the views that this one place offers to you, rather than the poet recluse can travel around or in between different owned spaces and enjoy all of the views that are available to him. Because of not being an owner, one can wander around and access all the important places. And also, relocating means that you can enjoy a particular view from different angles. I don't know, if you like Fuji Mountain and you can see it from all sides and not just limit yourself to this one framed view you're seeing from your building that you bought there that cost a lot of money. So here I would like to make the distinction or use the distinction made by Deleuze and Guattari in 1,000 Plateaus. I think you might be familiar with this. When they talk about nomadic space, they talk about striated and smooth space, the space of owners and the space of nomads. So the owner of a certain territory places himself in the middle of the square, whereas the nomad usually places himself, like on this image on the right, in the intersection of lines, keeping all the lines open. All the pathways are stemming from this one point. By placing oneself in this intersection, one keeps the options open. You can move, you can keep the intensity, you can stay in a certain kind of intensity while maybe changing locations. So when you think about it, we have to explain it, or Deleuze and Guattari explain it through different games. There is the game of chess and the game of Go. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Go. But in Go, there are no hierarchical relationship between the Go stones. They are all the same, these black dots. And they are usually placed on the intersections of the lines. They are all equal, and their power stems from the pattern they create, rather than from these particular chess pieces, which have their separate identity. And the power stems from the hierarchy of different chess pieces. So Deleuze and Guattari said the space is not at all the same. In chess, it is the question of arranging a closed space for oneself, thus going from one point to another. In Go, it is a question of arraying oneself in an open space, of holding space, of maintaining the possibility of springing up at any point. The movement is not from one point to another, but becomes perpetual, without aim or destination, without departure or arrival. And Kamo no Chōmei, and many people like him, inhabit, I think, both kinds of spaces. Coming from the Heian court hierarchy, Kamo no Chōmei also wanted to have the position of his father. He failed to do that. He was disappointed, renounced his earlier position, and chose this kind of space of nomads. But consciously, I think he has access to these two types of thinking. He does not want to worry oneself about ownership and hierarchy in the court anymore, renounces that and moves towards creating art. This becomes his main reason for living. And to do art, one has to maintain intensity. One has to have constant flow of kind of stimuli from the environment. In order to write good moon poetry, you need access to the moon. If you want to write about pines, you need to have pines. And then moving around is actually, I think, in a way, staying in the same place where, and by same place, I mean this kind of place where the intensity is high enough for writing poetry and playing music. So when the intensity goes lower, you need to relocate to keep all the levels higher again. So he writes, "Some mornings when I reflect that this life of mine is as fleeting as the white waves, I go to Okanoja to watch the boats, stealing a little of priest Manse's manner." This means he writes poetry in Manse's style. "Other times at evening, when the wind in the maples set the leaves to rustling, I think of that scene on the river at Shenyang and imitate the ways of Minamoto no Tsunenobu. If I'm still in the mood for music, I often play the melody of autumn wind, blending with the sighing of the pines, or perform the piece entitled The Flowing Fountain to accompany the rippling of the water." So here you see again, this river is so important for him as a symbol of impermanence, also because one of the foremost biwa players, this is a kind of a lute used in medieval Japan. You could see it on the first image, I think. You need to exercise to the sounds of the river. A certain type of murmuring of the river goes very well with the sounds you're producing with your biwa. In order to exercise it, you need to have access to this kind of river or go to the river to do it. You need to do certain places. You need to access certain places for writing certain kinds of poetry and so on. So nomad recluse, by renouncing the permanent self, can intimately access the different kinds of poetic places known from poetry. And these places are also spaces of shared experience for people living at that time. It's very difficult for us maybe to understand this, because for us creating means usually to be very individual, to create something very original. Only I could write or only I could build. But the medieval space of practice of poetry and practice of music meant that there were a lot of shared values, and these, for example, certain places became poetic places. Whenever one traveled to these places, one could access this field of experience that was available to other poets who wrote about this place. And one could also share one's creation with the whole maybe generation or previous generations of writers who had been there. These kind of holy places or poetic places, Thomas Kasulis has called them holographic entry points. So this image is created by Thomas Kasulis, who talks about intimacy in Japanese culture and says that if you think about this middle circle as self, it is usually this kind of self is created by the intersection or overlapping intimate shared space of many different selves and many different places. So there is no ego that is kind of cut off from the world or separated. These kind of Buddhist authors thought about them very much in this kind of way, that they should come out of their hard shell and open themselves up to the world. And through the meditative artistic practice, the artist softens the hard shell, you can see the hard shell again here, of ego, and opens oneself to the world until one's identity is enhanced by the overlap with the world. The work of art is an expressive intimation of the natural self-expression of the artist world. And I like how Thomas Kasulis here doesn't separate the artist and the world anymore, but rather uses the word artist world to express the whole that is at work. So this relationship of being or dwelling in the artist world, so to speak, is why one needs this movable dwelling, I think, in Kamo no Chōmei's case. That not to express myself, but rather be part of this constant self-expression of the artist world, and how to access that kind of self-expression that is not expression of my particular ideas anymore, but something much larger. So, in conclusion, I would like to say that citing Deleuze and Guattari again, we can say that nomad is not at all the same as the migrant. Migrant goes from one point to another, even if the second point is uncertain, unforeseen, or not well localized. But the nomad goes from point to point only as a consequence and as a factual necessity. The nomad knows how to wait. He has infinite patience. So basically, you can see that nomad can stay in one place all the time. Being nomad doesn't mean that you need to change place constantly, as people often think, but it rather means that you have patience. You have infinite patience. I imagine Kamo no Chōmei staying in one place, dwelling in his hut for years and years. There might be no necessity to move because the intensity is good. You can create, you can write, you can do music. But when something suddenly changes, when the environment doesn't really support the things I want to do anymore, then he might move. But moving doesn't mean actually going to a different place, but just changing location in order to stay in the same intensity. This is why I call it staying in the same place while moving around. Because place is this intimate access point, so to speak. And this access point itself might be relocated once in a while, and then you have to move along to as the people who move with the cattle might move because the sun moves, or the cows eat everything, so you need another place with the food. But you're essentially staying in the same place, in a place where things work. For Kamo no Chōmei, this smooth space is also, as I told earlier, a network of pathways or lines connecting the recluse to different practices, which all have their own speed and intensity. And these are intimately connected to his way of writing and his way of playing music. Again, we can't think of these non-dually. We have to see how they're all bound together into this one whole process of dwelling in a certain place. So the lines of ink on the paper one might draw when writing about oneself, tracing one's life with the brush on the paper, having peculiar texture like the rice paper has, where the bumps on the paper become bumps in one's life story, like losing one's father and so on. They're all embedded there in the texture of rice paper and process of writing. There are pathways one can walk on, heading towards Sarumaru's grave, for example, to contemplate death. But on the way there, one might notice patterns created by falling leaves and write an autumn poem instead. There are flows of music and wind, recreated by the interaction of fingers and long strings of biwa or koto. There are pathways of escape from robbers and flooding. There are lines of becoming, all bundled together into the experience of dwelling in the mountains. And this kind of dwelling in the mountains idea has, of course, fascinated many Japanese. And the idea of recreating this perfect movable dwelling has also inspired many architects. Here you can see one version of it. If you Google for Hojo no An or Kamo no Chōmei hut, you will find different examples by both amateur and professional architects, or their versions of this simple dwelling. And this one, built by architect Kengo Kuma recently, a year ago, in the Shimogomo Shrine, where Kamo no Chōmei was born, is a very interesting piece of work with magnets fixed on the latticed framework of cedar beams. and plastic sheets in sandwich structure. Maybe this tells you more than me. I just look at it as an interesting building. Unfortunately, I don't know how it looks like in a version you put on a cart, but I imagine you can use it, you can move it around with 1 or 2 carts. This idea of creating a space for contemplating, writing music and playing music has been a very powerful one in Japan, and I think in the future we can see more and more versions of this hut. So thank you for your attention. I think that's all. I use up all my time for questions. Sorry.
Alari, for a very skillful lecture. In his quest for the perfect temporary dwelling, Chōmei passed through many different stages. And one little question came to my mind that I think relates to this issue, and it's, contrary to some other perhaps nomadic Asian cultures, at least what I saw here in the lecture, he never arrived to the concept of the tent, and perhaps since you mentioned Deleuze and Guattari, take it a step further and think of a tent not made of kind of straight fabric, but maybe out of felt.
Yeah, that's a very similar idea, I think. But I think what can we put the slides back on? Not anymore, I think. Well, anyway, there was this a slide I didn't show from the inside of the building. Oh yeah, and that one I didn't show too. Le Corbusier also lived in the wooden hut in the end of his life and thought that that's the perfect way of dwelling, I guess. But going back to this slide I didn't show is that what he actually builds, he wants to have this more like a house, not as temporary as a tent might be, but kind of a space that has all the necessary accessories that he might have in a big house. So it's kind of a smaller version of a house where all the unnecessary has been taken out, but it still has some furniture. It needs to have space for the instruments. It needs to have this worshipping space. These orange boxes on this particular images are the boxes for his books. And we can see that he doesn't think that he should move all the time, but only when the necessity actually arises. So opposed to this kind of space are those real small huts that the traveling monks were building from actually branches and leaves. I think these huts from branches and leaves kind of fastly devised, very temporary in nature. These might be closer to tents. But Chōmei has this, I don't know, movable dwelling, sounds very fancy. The idea that all the houses should be like this, I think. That not only recluses' huts, but basically all the houses should be built in this way. And it also comes from the very ancient Japanese idea that whenever these gods were angry during the very old times, and the people say an emperor died, they had this tradition of moving the whole capital to a different location. And the last time when the attempt to move the whole capital happened was during Kamo no Chōmei's lifetime, where people actually packed together the capital of Heian, took it apart into wooden logs, and then Kamo no Chōmei describes in his text how they were sending the logs down the Yodo River to a new place in Fukuhara. And at some point it was that the old capital was not there anymore, and the new capital was not yet built, and all the logs were on the Odo River. And I think this is one of the things he describes here also. The flow, the river flows unceasingly, where the flow is the flow of buildings and people and everything that this, the whole dwelling takes place in this kind of flowing space. And the idea that, this last moving of the capital didn't work. It means that the buildings themselves are too big, but maybe if we were, if we all lived in these kind of smaller spaces, they would adjust to the changes. So I think it's like a halfway of tent and the real building. It's something very unique, I think.
Yeah, perhaps this kind of version kind of binds together the territory and with the dwelling much more than a tent would.
Yes, because in the case of tent, you're just, you need just a small open space. You don't worry about the environment very much. But with this movable
resources.
Yeah, but with this movable dwelling, he needs to worry about whether it is aesthetically connected to these all important places. So he thinks about also binding together these different pathways. Okay, if I position this building here, I stay here for 2 years, but I can take paths to this temple. I can see Sarumaru's grave. It's connected to the river. It's connected to the high up hiking way on the mountains. And when he has exhausted all these and practiced his instruments and wrote all the poems about it, it's much like the nomad has exhausted the pastures. So the intensity is not there anymore. I have exhausted this place. And then I move another place which is similar, structured in a similar way and keeps the intensity up again. So in that sense, he's a perfect idea of this kind of artistic nomad who moves where the intensity works for him.
Please ask questions for Alari.
Thank you. Okay, no, mine was a comment concerning the nowadays nomadic way of life.
Yeah.
Because, for example, we have been in 51 countries and I lived in several of these. Recently I moved like 103 parallels, but I'm always missing some place. I'm always missing some person. So I need to move, but I'm always in this kind of nostalgia. I don't know, nostalgia is
yeah.
Thank you.
What about the nostalgia? Is it the nostalgia for the good old days when you were still not moving around? I didn't really. Was it a comment or you wanted to ask something?
Yes,
Oh yeah. Well, I think Kamo and Chōmei also they all have this nostalgic past idea that there was a golden age somewhere in the 10th century where people wrote really good poetry and the houses were stable and we all stayed in Heian and nothing ever happened. But that's what he's writing about, is that this kind of stability is always a fiction, it's an illusion, because in real life no gold ages ever exist, and that's why he describes all the calamities and disasters and says that even if Heian might look eternal, or if we look at any other big city and it looks so fancy and we have really built something that lasts over ages, he says that this is never true. And this nostalgic feeling is filled with this sadness. In Japanese, it's aware. How sad it is that we can't really stay in one place, because in the end, he's also on this quest for permanence. It would be so great if I could find the building and the place, and it would be there eternally, and I could stay there, and it's always so good. But the reality is that it's never like that, right? You have to move. And when that's the true reality, we should start thinking about building and devising living spaces in such a way that they're not fixed anymore. Because something being fixed is illusory. Nothing is fixed.
Thank you, Alari, for this beautiful lecture about nomadism. I have also just more comment that your lecture reminded me that we Estonians have also had quite a pragmatic approach to our farmhouses and shelters.
Yeah.
Because of the construction, it has been very easy also to take and transport them from one place to another.
Mhm.
And I don't know if it is more specific on the islands, but for example in Hiiumaa it's really very popular that, for example, the woman whose man died, he took the beams and just moved with them from the countryside to the small city Kärdla.
Mhm.
And it's even nowadays that people evaluate the wooden materials so much, so they take them with us.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought about this too, that it's very close to our own practices of moving the smaller buildings around. But I guess in Estonian case, it's always been out of necessity to move to different other fields maybe, and more agricultural reasons. And these days, maybe something else too, that people buy these old houses and move them to other places. But I think, yeah, it could have been that in our case too, we would have had this idea of this type of temporary dwelling though. But I guess in Estonia, people wanted to stay in the same place, and it never really, in many cases, didn't work out that way. I think Japanese were also lucky that this philosophy in permanence supported this idea of moving around a little bit more, I guess. Yeah.
Hi. I was wondering about the difference you were making, or the difference in the definition you were making between nomads and migrants. And yeah, because it seems that with migrants, or who is a migrant then?
Yeah.
Doesn't everyone always move out the bleed if you're in a comfortable location?
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't you just stay? And could it be judged from the outside if you have lost your intensity or not? So I'm just wondering if there's even a need for this.
I think that's a very good question. I'm not quite sure that I know the very basic difference made by Deleuze and Guattari is that if you're moving to a point B, and you know where that particular point is. For example, you know that, for example, in New York there are higher salaries, and you move to New York because of that. There's an opening, and you envision yourself in that kind of other space, having an opening. Then you'd be traveling from A to B to a certain place there. But I think when you move to New York without really knowing what will happen to you there, you'd be a real nomad in that kind of Deleuze and Guattari sense, where you think maybe I'll be a taxi driver tomorrow, and then tomorrow and the day after that I have my own hotel, or maybe I'll be an artist. That means that you're keeping all the possibilities open, and that would be more, I think, closer to that kind of idea of, so you're moving around. Both of these people would be going to New York, but they would be going in a very different way, right?